Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I am the host of Relationship and Truth, and today I'm going to tackle a question that I've kind of received somewhat indirectly, but I'll pretend that it's a proper question just for the sake of discussion. And that question is basically this: what do you think about the books that are associated with the Bible but are not accepted as a part of the Protestant canon? That's a pretty broad question that covers a lot of material. Books that have been associated with the Bible historically is pretty big. That includes things like the Apocrypha, for example, the books and parts of books that the Catholics have in their Bibles that Protestants do not have in theirs, at least as part of the canon. Although you will find in some of the older Protestant Bibles that they did in fact include that. Some of it was for political and legal reasons, but some of the older Protestant translations did in fact include the Apocrypha, and some of them actually included it for a very long time, well into the early 1800s. Unless you're part of one of the Puritan groups and they got rid of it fairly early, that would be about 1666 if I remember correctly, that the Puritans had the Apocrypha expunged from their versions. So it would include things like the Apocrypha. It would also include some of the other intertestamental works that are associated with the Bible, books like First Enoch and Jubilees and stuff like that. It would include books that the Eastern Orthodox have in their Bibles in addition to what the Catholics have, and of course in addition to what the Protestants have. So that would include things like maybe 3rd and 4th Maccabees. I can't remember if the Catholics have the Psalms of Solomon or not, but the Eastern Orthodox generally do. Although technically the Eastern Orthodox do not have the fixed Old Testament canon, so what they do and do not have sometimes varies a little bit from one group to the next within Eastern Orthodoxy. And then there's the Tewahedo groups. They would also have First Enoch and a few other things, some of the Clementine literature and whatnot in their broader canon. And then, of course, there's other groups that have claimed to be Christian throughout history that have their own books. It would include the so-called New Prophecy of the Montanists. It would include the so-called hidden knowledge of the Gnostics. Groups like that. In more modern times, we would have books like the Book of Mormon from the LDS groups, and of course the Pearl of Great Price and the Doctrines and Covenants. Before that, a similar additional kind of book was, of course, the Quran with the Muslims under Muhammad. Of course, it wasn't in book form at that period. It was verbally recited during Muhammad's lifetime, and after that, then it got written down. So there's lots and lots of material that's in this broad category of books that have been associated with the Bible in one shape or form. And saying, how do I feel about that, or what is my response to that, is it's a little hard to pin it down to one simple sentence. But basically, I would say that those kinds of books and the issues that come up when we're talking about those kinds of books are an opportunity for Protestants and groups that would come out of Protestantism and still be within the pale of orthodoxy. For example, a lot of Bible-based evangelical groups and further extensions like that. A lot of these groups are usually only, distracted by these other books or upset by these other books in some way, only when they don't really have a good handle on what makes a book canonical in the first place. So that would be my first reaction, is that if these books are becoming an issue for you or in your church, now would probably be a really good time to study up on what actually makes a book canonical and how we know which books are and are not supposed to be in the Bible. And unfortunately, while that is a really great opportunity to study those things, because that's what all these books are kind of pointing to, is that whole question of how do you know these books and not these other books that we have. That's a great question that is raised by all those books. But unfortunately, my experience is that most Protestant groups and groups that come out of Protestantism haven't really given the subject of what is canonical a whole lot of thought. A lot of these groups will be very biblical in the way that they do things. They have regular sermons that are preaching from the Bible, oftentimes expositionally, just going through a passage and saying, what does this passage say? And then making appropriate application as they go through it. But they're very much so emphasize the Bible above all other standards, very much so in keeping with the Protestant principle of sola scriptura. But when it comes to why these books are these books, the answers that a lot of Protestants have come up with are sometimes a little vague and a lot of times not overly helpful. And what I've tried to do in this channel, one of the things that I've tried to do in this channel, is, if anything, to give people a good, solid understanding of why we have the books that we do. I've given presentations on that subject many times over the years now. And as many times as I give presentations on that topic, there are still plenty of people out there who claim to be Christians, and I'm not doubting that claim, but claim to be Christians, and yet ironically, even though they would hold up the Bible, the 66-book Protestant canon, as being the authority for their lives, the very thing on which they are betting their eternal soul, they don't have a very clear answer for why these books and not all of these other associated books. And you get some really weird ways of people dealing with it, unfortunately. A lot of groups have the kind of the knee-jerk reaction of it's not in the Bible and therefore, we need to shut down that discussion pretty much as soon as possible. And you'll get groups that, talk about, all the reasons why the Apocrypha is not in the Protestant canon. And frankly, a lot of those discussions specifically about the Apocrypha, they wind up saying a lot of things that are not true. Unfortunately, there's lots of myths that are associated with why we don't believe the Apocrypha as being canonical. Some of the apocryphal works are historical, and there's no great reason to doubt the history in them. But as far as being canonical, of course, we wouldn't accept them as canonical. But the question is why, and the reasons that a lot of Protestants give are very common answers within Protestant circles, but they're actually not based in fact a lot of times. For example, there are people, and I've actually heard presentations like this, sermons like this, basically, in which the preacher of a Protestant church is asked, why not the Apocrypha? And one of the reasons that he gives are, well, the Apocrypha wasn't written in Hebrew like the rest of the Old Testament books were. Why on earth that would be a standard at all is questionable. Where on earth in the Bible does God say that his revelation is only going to come through the Hebrew language? And if that is in fact true, then why wasn't the New Testament primarily written in the Hebrew language, which it wasn't? Historically, we know exactly what happened with that. The form of the New Testament that was meant to be published to all for the institutional church was very much so Koine Greek. There's no historical doubt about that. There were a couple of the books in the New Testament that early on seemed to have a different form, possibly Hebrew or Aramaic, but within the lifetime of the apostles with a capital A, the ones that Jesus chose, or the ones that they themselves chose to replace, ones that they lost, like Judas, so that would be Matthias in that case. Those people were the ones who oversaw the publication of the New Testament in its various forms at the time. It wasn't printed as one book at the time, but in its various and separate works. They're the ones that oversaw its publication in the Koine Greek. No historical doubt about that whatsoever. So if you're giving the idea that it has to be given in Hebrew for it to be canonical when it comes to the Apocrypha, it's not consistent with the New Testament at the very least, but it's also an outright lie. Yes, some of the apocryphal works, the so-called apocryphal works, we do in fact have good evidence that their earliest forms are in fact Greek or something like that, but it's not true that that's the case with all of them. With some of them, we know that there's a very good chance that they were written in either Hebrew or Aramaic. For example, I think it was Jerome, the church father Jerome, who said that he knew of manuscripts for Tobit and Judith that were written in Aramaic. There's also parts of the Old Testament's proper canon that are Aramaic. So why wouldn't those be acceptable if it's just a language issue? Then, let's see, I think First Enoch is also like that. There are Aramaic, and I think maybe even one Hebrew manuscript, maybe even more, for it. And then First Maccabees, no, not First Maccabees, Sirach. Sirach was originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic as well, and it got translated into Koine Greek, and the translation itself says that it's a translation. There's a little prologue in there that talks about the translation work. So these arguments that a lot of people come up with as a knee-jerk reaction to why we don't have those books, a lot of times they're just flat out not true. And people perpetuate them because they haven't studied the issue for themselves, and they're really worried about people latching onto these books and winding up with, strange, weird heresies as a result of it. So you have on one reaction kind of this blind fear that's, like I said, a lot of times the arguments that are made as a result of that blind fear are just flat out false, and that doesn't do the faith any good. If you really believe that these 66 books are the right books, and your only arguments against any other books are arguments that are based on lies, well, that doesn't exactly help your position. And people who are interested in those books, who do study them out for themselves, are going to think that you're a liar because you lied to them. And all that it's going to do is drive people to those books more and more because they see how you mishandled them. So that's one extreme, is you have people lying about these books in order to keep people away from them. And then on the other extreme, you have people who go to these books and say, you know what, there's a lot of these that have a worldview that is essentially the same as that of the Bible. And there are parts of these that are very much so real history. And there are even some of these books that get referenced or quoted in the Bible itself. For example, 1 Enoch is directly quoted in the New Testament book of Jude. It is very much so a true quote from the book of 1 Enoch. There's really no doubt about that whatsoever. And they look at that and say, well, if the Bible is, they have the same basic worldview, and if the Bible is directly quoting these things, well, then we should give these things basically the same kind of due consideration that we give the rest of the Bible. And then you can wind up with some really strange emphases, especially depending on how far people take that. And you have people with, like 67 and 68 and on and on and on as far as the number of books in their canon, because they keep adding these ones that they like. So on one hand, you have people that have no idea what they're talking about, but are really sure that these books are bad. And then on the other hand, you have people who realize that these books are a part of the biblical worldview that decide, hey, bring them in. It's just great and fine and wonderful. And what I would recommend is that people who are coming into this study try to take a little bit more balanced approach. Throughout church history, you've had, both of the extremes represented, but you've also had kind of a middle way, if you were, of people who were aware of these books and found them to be very beneficial in some regards, but also who realized that what makes a book canonical distinguish these books from the truly canonical works. And so they were able to hold them in this place where they were useful, but not canonical. And I would argue that that is the proper view that a Protestant should have regarding these books. And that ultimately comes down to the Protestant knowing what makes a book canonical or not, and therefore being able to evaluate these things correctly, so as to know that they are truly not canonical, and also be able to deal with them fairly in terms of what kind of usefulness they may or may not have. Because, like, say, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, for example, are primarily historical, and it's not a bad thing at all to know that history. And then the book of Sirach, for example, it's a piece of wisdom literature, and there's a lot of good wisdom to be gained from it. It's not bad necessarily to study these kinds of things, but like I said, that comes down to knowing why these books are not canonical and why the 66 books of the Protestant canon are. And that's really what this all hinges around. When people ask me, so what about these books? My question, or the reframe of the question, is always going to be, how do you know whether or not this book is canonical? How do you know if this is a part of the special revelation that God has given to His church? And if you cannot answer that question in a thoroughly meaningful and honest way, then yeah, the rest of the discussion, you're probably going to wind up on either side of that aisle of going to extremes, of either one extreme of saying, no, we shouldn't look at these things at all, bad, evil, hiss, and basically making up bad stories about them, to the other side where, hey, these books are a part of the biblical worldview. Some of them even get quoted in the Bible. Therefore, they're great, fine, wonderful. Let's go all the way and just include these in, and we'll start talking about them on Sunday. It'll be great. Like I said, throughout church history, there's a lot of people that, yes, went to the extremes, because humans tend to do the extreme thing, but there are also a lot of people that were in the middle on this subject, saying, yes, it's good to keep these books around. No, we do not treat these books like we treat the proper canonical books. And understanding why people would be able to make that distinction is important. That's what this channel has tried to do so many times. Like I said, I've given many presentations on that topic. You can look through the history of the videos on this channel, and you will see those presentations come up multiple times. And I would suggest that that would be the best place to start looking first. Before you get into the books in and of themselves, ask yourself that fundamental question of what makes something canonical. And if you're going to present to your church, your congregation, on this topic, make sure that you know properly what makes something canonical. Make sure that you can really answer that question. And sadly, most Protestants can't, which is why in this channel I present that topic so often, so that people will have a reference for it. But yeah, that's basically my response to the question. What do I think about these books? I think that they are a good impetus for the Protestant church as a whole to come to a better understanding of what the canon is. Like I said, there's a lot of defenses of the Protestant canon that are just simply not true. Like I said, people make up lies about some of the proposed books that are out there, and that doesn't help anyone. We need to be thorough in our examination of these things, and we need to give good, solid answers. There's people, for example, that I wouldn't say are so much lying about anything as they give basically a non-answer, and that would be people who say, well, we know that these books are right because they teach the right things, and we know they teach the right things because they agree with what our group teaches, which is right. And it becomes a very vicious circle very quickly. And not all circular reasoning is false. If your circular reasoning is basically to say that an ultimate authority is ultimate, well, that is actually technically a valid form of reasoning. What makes something vicious, though, is when it's circular reasoning that can be applied indiscriminately. Because any group can say, well, we're the right group because we have the right books, and we know that these are the right books because we're the right group. Pretty much any group that can say that. The Catholics can say that, the Eastern Orthodox can say that, the Mormons can say that, the Muslims can say that. Any group can make that kind of a claim. And because any group can make that kind of claim, even if it is technically true for your group and not for them, the fact that it can be applied indiscriminately, though, reveals that it is not actually a useful argument in and of itself, because it doesn't discriminate. It can apply it indiscriminately to any group, and any group can use that reasoning to defend their own group and their own group's beliefs and their own group's books. So when you're coming to why these books and not others, when you're coming to the question of how to answer what makes something canonical, you need to be looking for something that actually discriminates, something that another group cannot claim for themselves, something that actually points to the uniqueness of these books in contrast to all their books. And like I said, that's something that I've presented on this channel multiple times. I'm not going to get into it here because I want to keep the video relatively short, but that's what you need to be looking for when it comes to getting into this topic. Before you get into the books themselves, you need to sit back and ask yourself, what is it that actually makes a book canonical or not? And is that a standard that can actually, that is actually discriminatory rather than indiscriminate? That is, does it make a distinction? Does it discriminate? That's what discrimination in the classical sense means. It's been greatly politicized today, but in the classical sense, discrimination is a good thing. It allows you to say this and not that. This is a standard that only applies to these books, and it cannot be applied to those books by anyone. That's the kind of standard you're looking for. Something that shows the uniqueness of a particular set of books. And if you don't have that, then you have most likely some form of vicious circular reasoning. Like I said, not all forms of circular reasoning are false. If it involves an ultimate standard, well, it's ultimate because it's ultimate, and that's not invalid. But like I said, it might not be particularly discriminatory. And a standard that is indiscriminate, that can be applied to anyone and anyone can claim it for themselves, isn't a useful standard. So that's my suggestion. Sorry I got repetitive, but that's the issue. If you're interested in these books, figure out what makes something canonical and make sure that your standards are discriminatory. That is, there's a meaningful difference between the books you accept and the books that other people accept. Thank you very much for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to know the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.